Hi, I'm Karine Jamel. I'm Anishinaabe Métis, and I was Director of Research for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls.
Hi, everybody. My name is Paya Robinson. I, along with Chief Commissioner Buller, Commissioner Odette, and Eyolfson, was one of the 4 commissioners in the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. The mandate of the National Inquiry was to inquire and report on the root causes of violence against Indigenous women and girls, to look at the systemic causes in society, our economy, cultural causes, institutional and historic causes of violence. We were also asked to examine institutional policies and practices that have been implemented in response to violence and that have shown to be effective in reducing the violence. We were asked to provide recommendations, concrete and effective actions that would remove the systemic causes of violence. We were also asked to identify ways that those lost to violence could be honored and commemorated. The National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls was the first of its kind, and it was the first truly national inquiry. It was actually 14 joint inquiries, as we had mandates from the federal, all provincial and territorial governments. Launched in September of 2016, we delivered our final report on June 3rd of 2019. Our final report included 2 volumes, 231 calls for justice, as well as a supplementary report explaining our genocide analysis. The work of the National Inquiry came on the heels of decades of work by Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples, and families and survivors of violence, who for decades advocated for justice and advocated for a national inquiry. The need for an inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women was also identified by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where in their call to action 41, they called on governments to institute the inquiry, citing the need for this work to be done in order for reconciliation work to begin. It is on the heels of that work, as well as many international reports, that our work commenced. The objective was to learn about what violence looks like for Indigenous women from Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples, to examine the systems, agencies, and institutions through their lived experiences, specifically through their encounters with it. We also wanted to evaluate these encounters and these institutions and agencies against a human rights and an Indigenous rights lens, also looking at the realities that in Canada we have legal pluralism, where Indigenous laws also play an important role. Our objectives were threefold: to find the truth, honor the truth, and give life to the truth. Finding the truth required us to hear from people from across the country, from women and survivors and their families, and to gather their stories of their encounters with systems and institutions and with violence. Collectively, these stories showed us what violence looks like for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples in Canada. Honoring the truth required centering the Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples in our work, recognizing and honoring their historic and present-day roles, leadership, and contributions. By honoring and respecting Indigenous ways of thinking and doing, respecting that Inuit, Métis, and First Nations all approach things in unique and distinct ways. By creating culturally safe and trauma-informed spaces during our process and also in our reports and our calls for justice. Giving life to the truth came through our record, our reports, the artistic expressions, the educational tools developed, the commemoration works, and ultimately the calls for justice. But giving life to the truth also comes in what we all do collectively now, how we take what we've learned from the inquiry and from those who shared their truths with us, and how we make change in our country.
Our greatest teachers as part of this process were, in fact, the Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirited, and trans people, and families, and the survivors who stepped forward. Our truth-gathering process had 3 parts. So in part 1, we did want to speak to the real experts. experts, the family members and survivors, who then helped us shape and form the issues and the topics we might want to look into in parts 2 and 3, which focus more on institutions as well as on experts and knowledge keepers. We also created, as part of part 1, the Legacy Archive, which was the collection of over 800 different artistic expressions. And this was a way to acknowledge Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding and communicating in a way that went beyond a Western sort of evidentiary approach to truth gathering. For me, coming into this process, I really wanted to understand and to unpack this language of crisis, which I think, and being a historian by training, really does mask the ongoing and very long history of colonization and the structures that persist from today in our communities, and that serve to structure Indigenous encounters with the state. For me as a historian, and when I talk about this, I like to talk about the idea of colonization as a structure rather than an event, to really think about how things like residential school system, the federal day school system, the 60s scoop, child apprehension, and other issues that people face are really part of a larger narrative that seeks to dehumanize and also exclude Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous expertise, and also to exclude the ways that we know about ourselves and that we understand the solutions. As one of the people that testified before the National Inquiry articulated, and this person was also a member of our National Family Advisory Circle, I feel like my spirit knows violence. And I think that that really speaks to the multi-generational and intergenerational nature of a lot of the things that we heard about from family members and from survivors. We wanted to know what violence looks like, as Kaya said, but we also wanted to know what violence feels like. And then, as related to that, we wanted to know what hope looks like and what hope feels like. I think that we all really felt deep within ourselves this notion that our grandmothers and our elders told us over and over again, the idea that our women and girls are sacred. And so we really look to survivors and family members, not just to share with us sort of the story of their loss or of the tragedy, but also to share with us the things that brought them strength, the things that brought them hope, and the ways that we might address finding a way through this violence for better outcomes for Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirited and trans people, but also whole families, whole communities, and whole nations. For me, in writing the report and approaching it as the director of research, I knew that the most powerful thing that we had wasn't in technical language, and it wasn't in legalese or in jargon. It was actually in the everyday encounters, places that people could see that could just easily have ended up being them or one of their family members that were conveyed by survivors and families. And so our report set out 4 root causes, and I think that they really speak to all of the stories, even though all of the stories are really unique and diverse. The first root cause that we identified was multi-generational and intergenerational trauma. I think that I can safely say that there wasn't one story that we heard where people weren't impacted by things that had happened in previous generations or to other family members. The other root cause that we identified was economic and social marginalization. We wanted to look at marginalization as an active process and not as something that happens accidentally, but something that's done to people or groups of people. We also wanted to look at institutional lack of will in maintaining the status quo. The reality is, as we heard many times over, governments have do know about many of the issues and problems that exist, and at various times in history, but also today, they've chosen to confront these issues or not to, and that matters. And then finally, we wanted to identify as a root cause the failure to accept the agency and the expertise of Indigenous women, girls, and also communities. We heard about so many different programs and things that were making a difference in the lives of people that were suspended because of bureaucracy or because of problems that could have easily been confronted if we only recentered our understanding of these systems as the process of reclaiming power in place. And that really brings me to the report. It's a really different kind of report, and if you haven't read it, please go read it. Go read a few pages, just pick it up. It really is led by the voices of families and survivors. And because of that, it's really powerful work. We really tried to identify the ways that family members and survivors conceived of healing, conceived of justice. And that was in large part through a reclamation of Indigenous power and of the place of Indigenous women in their communities. There are beautiful stories from every community. There are stories about people who went missing or who were murdered, who were so central in the lives of their families that nothing has ever been the same since they left. All that to signal the importance of looking at Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited and trans people, and indeed all people, as family members, as human beings, and as people who matter. I think that all of these understandings and the understanding that for most people, the decisive moment in their life was actually found in this encounter that they had with an idea or a structure or a system where things either went really badly or led a loved one to harm, were really what we wanted to keep in mind in thinking about how we might approach our calls for justice.
Sorry, that brings us to the calls for justice. And Karen has indicated the calls for justice seek to address those 4 root causes of violence, to address and promote healing from historic and intergenerational, multigenerational trauma, to eliminate the social and economic marginalization of Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples, as well as their communities, to disrupt this lack of political will and to disrupt the status quo, and finally, to restore Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples for their rightful place of positions of power. This is about respecting their agency, their expertise, and their political rights, their fundamental human rights. And when it comes to implementation, this is fundamentally about compliance with human rights and Indigenous rights, legal instruments. And Canada is signatories to these and has legislation of our own. It's about properly implementing our laws as they exist, but also going beyond that. It's about our daily encounters at institutional levels, structural levels, and individual levels, and making sure that our interactions are rooted in respect for fundamental human dignities, that they're rooted in relationships, and that those relationships promote the humanity and the rights of Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples. I won't go into all of the calls for justice because there are 231, but what's really important to understand is that how we approach implementation is as fundamentally important as what we do. And we spent a lot of time talking about the principles of change. We see these as building blocks for meaningful and permanent transformation, basic principles that permeate and inform all of our calls for justice. And really, they should be considered the guiding principles for all individuals, agencies, institutions when we start looking at implementing and interpreting the calls for justice. One very fundamental and important principle is recognizing humanity. Indigenous peoples' humanity, their fundamental human rights and Indigenous rights. And the work that we do must be focused on achieving substantive equality. Secondly, we must take a decolonizing approach. This, I understand, frustrates people, and they pause and they go, well, we can't go back in time. But this isn't about going back in time. This is about honoring and respecting and holding space for Indigenous values, philosophies, practices, and knowledge systems. We have to really actively unpack the way we do what we do. And we need to reject the idea that Euro-Canadian ways of knowing and doing hold exclusive value and legitimacy. Thirdly, inclusion of Indigenous people, specifically families and survivors and those with lived experience. They have the most hands-on experience, and their truths and their understandings invariably lead to the most effective and meaningful outcomes. It's also fundamental for their political rights as well. Self-determination and ensuring that services and initiatives are Indigenous-led is also an imperative. Again, it's the best practice. It results in the most meaningful and effective solutions. But it's also a fundamental right as recognized under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Article 3 and 4. When non-Indigenous organizations are engaging in this work, this must be in true partnership and with true respectful relationships with Indigenous partners. The idea that the solutions can be imposed on Indigenous communities has to be rejected. It has never worked. It will never work. Fifth is the recognition of distinctions. And this can also be equated to discourse around intersectionality. We have to reject the myth that Indigenous peoples are a monolith, that there's pan-indigeneity. Inuit, Métis, First Nations, and even amongst Métis communities, Inuit communities, and First Nations, there's distinctions: urban, northern, southern, gender. We have to recognize and do the work in a way that respects and recognizes those distinctions. Cultural safety is also incredibly important in services and in processes. And cultural safety means empowerment. At a minimum, cultural safety requires the inclusion of Indigenous languages, laws, protocols, spirituality. The seventh, and one that was touched on by Kevin, and I think that is so important, is the recognition of the impacts of trauma. Trauma is going to inform how we do our work. It informed how we did our work in the inquiry, and it must inform how we do our work moving forward in every aspect of our lives. We have to recognize the trauma, and we need to respond appropriately in our practices, in our policies, and our protocols. And these are the fundamental principles of change that must guide all of our interpretation and our work moving forward.
I think that what we both would like to underscore is the fact that even though we're standing or sitting, I guess we're not standing, we're sitting here with you today. One of the things that's really important to note is that, you know, we didn't accomplish this work and we didn't walk this journey on our own. And there were so many family members and survivors, but also our own advisories, the National Family Advisory Circle, who worked so hard with us to tell us when we were doing things right, but also to tell us when we were not doing things right. The grandmothers and the elders advisory circle, all of those people who walked with us, who really believed in what we were doing and how we were doing it, which sort of leads me to what I want to talk about, which is that I think that the process that we had teaches us almost as much as the report or the findings themselves. You know, those calls for justice that Kaya talked about, they came from over 8,000 different recommendations made by family members, by survivors, by parties of standing, and by other people. And so the how in this was as important as the what, and I think there are some really important implications for people that are engaged in research or policy work to keep in mind. I think what I'd like to say is first, we really learned and relied on the notion of centering lived experience and intersectional research, the idea of experience as the greatest teacher. And there's so much in all of the stories that was shared that we could have never known by reading a paper or Googling an article. You know, there was so much about the nuances of all of the experiences, both the similarities in the experiences, but also the distinctions in the experiences that we never would have been able to get to if we weren't walking in relationship with family members and survivors, and if we weren't hearing those stories directly. I think the other thing that this process teaches us is to really respect the power of strength-based research, including story work, which in turn helps affirm the importance of Indigenous epistemologies and ways of knowing. When we heard the story about Copper Woman, who ended up helping her family by teaching them that they had the tools to change the situation in themselves, or when we heard about Sky Woman and her journey from the sky to usher in this great process of creation, we weren't just hearing stories. We were hearing about concrete ways to reclaim power in place. We were hearing about what's valuable about Indigenous ways of knowing. And we were learning about what it really means to reclaim power in place. I think too, as a researcher, the idea of thinking about our research methodology as often being deficit-based, and instead turning that into a strength-based approach is very important. I think that strength-based work turns people into the solution rather than the problem. And there's just so much work that goes on that talks about what's wrong with people or what's wrong with communities, and that focuses on deficit-based interpretations of what's going on historically or today. I think that thinking about strength-based work and actually thinking about what's right with people and what's going right with communities and what tools that people have that exist in them is really, really, really important. I think finally, I just want to say that I think central to all of this is our relational ways of knowing. I've had the opportunity lately to work with a lot of elders from Manitoba, and one of the things that we're really talking about right now is this idea of Minigawisiwin, which is another word for gifts. And the idea is that, everybody has gifts and we're all given gifts by Creator, but none of us has the gifts that we need to live a good life, and that we all need to rely on each other and also to share our gifts to be able to live a good life. I think the notion of sharing these gifts and having these gifts has been really important for me, even in the time since the inquiry. And I wish that I had had a better understanding of it when I was there, but it's really helped to build on what I think that many family members and survivors were trying to tell us and were trying to share, which is to say that everybody that came forward, that shared their story, was bringing their own gifts, and that what we were able to accomplish together was only possible because all of the gifts that people brought together to do this work. I think that we are responsible to the families and to the survivors who came forward and who shared their truths and their stories. And I think that what we need to do now is to engage in this work on an ongoing basis, being responsible to those stories and to those experiences. We have learned so much from families and survivors, and they have so much that they want for non-Indigenous Canadians to know. And so I think that we encourage you, or I know that we encourage you, to actually read the final report and to hear their stories. And in the meantime, we'd like to introduce you to some of these incredible people, many of whom are still working on this issue today.
Je suis ma grand-mère.
I am my mother.
Je suis ma sœur.
I am my auntie.
Anna Lasta.
I am my daughter.
I
am my wife.
I am my best friend.
We are the families and survivors of missing and murdered Indigenous women,
girls, two-spirited, and trans people.
We are the voices of our lost loved ones who are calling out to be found.
And we echo their cries for justice.
We shed tears.
We shed tears for our sisters.
Nous sommes restés en arrière
to tell their stories.
Pour partager la vérité.
Our ancestors protected our ways so we could survive and persevere.
Our relationship with Canada was created in peace,
friendship, and trust.
La paix, l'amitié et la confiance.
Promising prosperity,
abundance, and well-being.
La confiance brisée a érodé.
Broken trust has eroded this relationship,
jeopardizing what we hold most sacred.
Our women and girls.
Nos femmes et nos filles.
We are here to restore their dignity
and forge a path for change.
Our children are our future.
We must protect them.
Nous devons les protéger.
We ask all Canadians
to stay with us.
To stand with us in ending all forms of violence.
Learn about the truthful,
la vraie histoire of the relationship between First Nation,
Inuit, and Métis people and Canada.
Honor that truth by upholding their rights.
By upholding their rights.
and respecting our sisters.
Et en respectant leurs valeurs.
Our language.
Our treaties and our way of life.
With clean water, housing, and safety.
And respecting our women, our children, and our families.
Donner vie à la vérité en devenant des alliés.
By becoming allies and advocating for change needed.
I love you, baby.
Good job.
Thank you so much.
Taken, not forgotten.
Taken, not forgotten.
I am here to speak for those who cannot speak.
Our women and girls are sacred.
Our women and girls are sacred.
I'm here for justice.
I am a change maker. Are you?
J'initie le changement. Et vous?
I am a change maker. Are you?
Tutsi. My name is Dr. Robin Bourgeois. I'm an associate professor in the Center for Women and Gender Studies, and I'm acting vice provost of Indigenous engagement at Brock University. In addition to studying missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, but also state-based responses to this violence, I also testified in the inquiry. I was an expert and experiential witness on the topic of sexual violence and human trafficking. So one of the questions that a lot of people have is, how do we take up the report, but also its research strategy in our work as academics? What does that look like? How do we engage with it? How do we advance that work of the report? And how do we respond to those 231 calls for justice as academics in a way that's productive, a way that helps advance the cause? And so that's really what I want to talk to you about today. And I'm going to draw on some of my own experiences in doing this at Brock University. So let's start with the big initiative. For me, that has been a group called the Decolonial Reading Circle. When the report dropped and I had concerns, I had studied our previous attempts at participating in inquiries and commissions as Indigenous women and girls. And what I found was that lots of our findings, our reports and our recommendations, those reports sat on shelves, and that they weren't often taken up, and they certainly weren't regularly taken up in the academy at all, at least based on my experience. And so I decided that I was going to be part of the solution here around this. And I wanted to make sure that the folks at Brock, and that means just, staff, student, and faculty, but we also consider the broader community as part of our community. So I wanted to create an opportunity for all of those groups to be able to come together and read the final report in its entirety and to talk about it and the 231 calls for justice. And so that's what I did. I created the Decolonial Reading Circle. The first circle ran last year, so 2019. We began in the fall. We meet about once a month throughout September to April. There was so much demand in the first year. There was when I had my first info sessions, I had over 90 people sign up to be part of this group. And so I ended up actually having to hold 2 circles, and we ran 2 circles consecutively. One would be in the afternoon and one would be in the evening, and 2 groups read through the report. Now, ultimately, we were hoping to achieve a call to a response, an action plan to the calls for justice. And unfortunately, COVID derailed that plan. We went offline. This year, given that we are online and that's the foundation from which we're working, we are going to make that a priority because we have continued the circle. Again, we are reading the report, and this year, thanks to core funding, I've been able to hire a co-facilitator, and the co-facilitator, her name is Fallon Farinacci, and she is actually a member, or she was a member of the Family Advisory Council for the Inquiry. So this has been a really great experience for folks and an opportunity for them to be able to not only engage with people who study this, but people who participated in this process, and to talk about the report, hear more about it, and also consider how we at Brock and in the community of particularly in the Niagara region, how we can respond to the 231 calls for justice. And so that's been one way that we have tried to address that at Brock. How do we take up that report? Now, that's just one thing though. One of the questions often that's asked is, how do we take up not only the report, but also the research process in our own work as academics? So I'm going to start with pedagogy at first. So how do we teach this report? And I find students are really eager to read it. I found that sometimes it's hard to get them to read the entire thing. So what I've done is I've assigned the executive summary, the calls for justice, and quite often the chapter on genocide, because that's a popular conversation in my classes. And what we end up doing as an activity in those classes is that I have the students look at the 231 calls for justice, and I ask them to identify a few that they think that Brock University could respond to directly. And then I actually ask them to take that individual call and brainstorm ideas about how that response would look. And so my students have done this several times, and I've taken photographs and images of that reporting of those sessions, because they have some brilliant ideas about what the university can do to change things. And at the point when we develop a formal response to the calls for justice, those ideas will be incorporated. Another thing that's really, in terms of research, I think, I'm going to go to the research part of this now. The strategy used by the inquiry is really a strategy that anyone, Indigenous or not, should be using when they do research on Indigenous topics. What's really important here is that the research isn't top down. So it's not a researcher having an idea and deciding how to go with that. This research strategy turns that on its head, and it says the starting point is community. You start and you talk to Indigenous folks in community, and you find out their needs, their concerns, their interests, and that's how you build a research strategy. And I think that's so important. That is really what decolonial research looks like within the academy, is when you start with community and you support what Indigenous folks are really interested in, the kind of research they need. The really important thing is that this is about relationship building, and it's about taking time to listen to people. And that's not just a research strategy. When I was preparing for this talk and I was talking to my co-panelists about this, I said that strategy actually informed my approach to my leadership approach in my new position as acting vice provost of Indigenous engagement. When I first got on, I've only been on a month, and everybody keeps asking me, what's your strategy? What's your goals? What are your plans for this? And I've honestly answered many times, I don't know yet, because that is not the right approach. I'm not a top-down leader. What I needed to do, and I've been very clear about this, is that I needed to talk to community. I needed to talk to Indigenous peoples. I needed to talk to non-Indigenous peoples. I needed to hear what the priorities were. I needed to hear what we've already been doing, so I didn't reinvent the wheel. And I also wanted to hear concerns and things that, you know, the community felt needed to be addressed. And so that has been my strategy in leadership as well. So it's not just even about research, it's about how, if we're going to do decolonial work at the institution, this research strategy from the inquiry really sets a groundwork for how we do that decolonial work, even as administrators. So that's just some ideas of ways that within the academy we can engage with the report, but also how we can mobilize that research strategy.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all those who have joined this panel at this year's Celebration of Excellence and Engagement being put on by the Royal Society of Canada. It is a tremendous honor for me. My name is Kaya Robinson. I was one of the commissioners to be moderating this panel and to be joined by Robin and Karine. We are going to enter into a question and answer phase. Apologize for the awkwardness of pre-recorded sessions. I have to admit we were all kind of, I was at least cringing at how that went, but I'm hoping that we can make the remainder of this session as sort of organic as possible. We are eager to have these conversations with you and to engage with you. Karine and Robin, with their experience and the work that they're doing, I think are tremendous leaders in research and academia and in policy work. And I'm hoping that this conversation can assist all of you in the work that you are engaging in or want to engage in. This is often, I say, and I like to point out and I like to emphasize how much of a misconception it was that this was a study of Indigenous women and girls in violence. This is a study of Canada. And this is about our history and our society. And when we relegate the issue of violence against Indigenous women and girls and gender diverse people, or any of the realities that Indigenous peoples are living with, to being their issue alone, we deny our collective history and we deny our potential as a country. So I'm hoping, I believe, if I understand the system correctly, I should be receiving questions in the little chat box. Please ask questions. I expect some of you are just having itchy fingers and want to, but you don't want to be the first one to do it. Please just go, do it, type. However, in the meantime, I'll get Robin and Karine speaking. Thank you both so much for all the work that you've done prior to the inquiry, for your work with the inquiry, Karine, and you, Robin, for your testimony, and for the work that you did prior to the inquiry and then continue to do. You talked a lot about process, and in some of the previous conversations I've had, different conferences and sessions since the release of our report, one of the things that tends to happen is there's a bit of a paralysis. People go, this is so much. There's so much. I mean, the volumes of the text, the calls for justice, it's so much. And the question that I receive often is, where do I start at a very individual level? So perhaps we do have a question come in. But let's start with that one question about where do you start? And perhaps, Robin, you can lead that one. And then Karine, if you want to add a bit, and then we'll go into the questions from the audience.
Sure. And I think, you know what, to be honest, I think this answer really varies per person, because what one person is capable of doing is different from what others are capable of doing. And so I always say, you know, take where you're at and start there. And so for some people, that means reading the report. You know, if they're not familiar with the details of this Canadian context of violence, you know, it really is a starting point there. And I often say to people, you know, yes, I'm a professor, but, you know, in my kind of activist and community career, I think I've spent 75% of that time over 20 years trying to educate people about this violence. So one step a lot of people can do really easily is read the report. It's so accessible. Like, it's huge, I know, in scope. It looks big and daunting, but it really is written in a way that's accessible, that's really well organized, that paints a really clear picture. And I think it's really set up so that it is something that most people could pick up and just read it, get it, and totally understand the context. And then I think the big lesson is always, then you do something. And that could look at a couple ways. And sometimes that could be, you know, maybe you support the efforts of Indigenous women. I always say that's a great starting point, because nothing about us without us. I keep saying that. So we need to be part of that. But if you see, you know, Indigenous women who are leading these efforts and you maybe have an opportunity to support them, that's a really great thing to do. At the same time, you could also mobilize yourself. You know, our campus is really interesting right now because we're going through decolonization and equity are actually a priority. And so we've had groups of, you know, like we have non-Indigenous and predominantly white professors who are doing a white supremacy group and walking through what does it mean to be, to experience white privilege. And I think you could do the same around this. You could have these kinds of conversations about, you know, there's 231 calls to justice. How could we respond in a way? And so I think, I don't want to take up too much time because I've talked a little bit about this and I want to leave space for others, but those are really kind of my first instincts when people ask. And you know what, it is big, but we're all in this together and every little thing helps. And those little things come together and create big change. So that would be my perspective there.
Yeah, and just to add to what Robin's already really helpfully laid out, I think, like, speaking from the research perspective, one of the things that was very striking in the report, and that he didn't really elaborate on in the pre-recorded awkward part of this conversation, was this notion that in every story that we heard, whether somebody was coming from a rural community or an urban center, or like whatever the community that was identified was, one of the things that was really interesting in all the stories was that there was these key moments where people came up against a person or an institution or an idea or a structure. And it did, you know, as I mentioned, ultimately structure what came next. And so, you know, if we think about it on the macro level, these are big ideas and big systems. But we think about who works in those systems, those are people, those are individuals. And so I would just encourage for people to think about all the different encounters where they might engage Indigenous people or Indigenous issues. And then within those spaces, whatever they may be, whether it's a casual encounter or like a policy encounter or whatever your space of engagement is with Indigenous people and issues, I think that there's a space to think about how you can transform those encounters or relationships into something that promotes healing rather than causes harm. I think that's.
Thank you, both of you. We've got some questions coming in, and the first one is from Dawn. How would you describe the progress or lack thereof since the report was published in 2019? I might add to this one a little bit following you too. I have some thoughts.
Okay. Well, I guess I can start. So I was approached earlier this summer to start working on the National Action Plan to address the very first call for justice in our report, the need for governments to come up with a national action plan. And so I have been working on that, and it's really a collaborative process, which is why it takes some time. We're working on building consensus. There's a lot of different people at the table. They include the national Indigenous organizations, but also some grassroots people and groups, some academics, some family members and survivors, many family members and survivors, some of whom are the same that were part of the national inquiry. And so, you know, I think what we've all identified as really problematic is the lack of communication around the work that we're doing. And that's something that we're really pushing hard as people that are involved in this process to really push the government to be a bit more transparent about what it's doing, because I'm hearing the same things around sort of like, well, nothing's being done. And then I'm looking at like thousands of emails and meetings over the last 3 months and going, oh, we're working really hard. That's to say, though, that I think that one of the important parts around the calls for justice is that they're not just for governments. And so while we are maybe waiting for governments to go ahead, as Robin's work demonstrates, as some of the other work that's gone on, you know, in the Yukon, for example, in the province, or in other places, you know, people don't have to wait for the government to do it. There are calls for police, there are calls for there are calls for police, there are calls for healthcare workers, there are calls for everyone. And so it's really everyone, there are calls for all Canadians. So, you know, we don't have to wait to engage in action, even though we're waiting for a national action plan. And then I would say, and Kaya, you may have some more examples, that there's been some specific things that I think have happened. There's a few provinces within which birth alerts have been ended. That was one of our calls for justice. There's been some investment, I believe, in health infrastructure in the north. That was another one of our calls. And I'll sort of leave it to other people to talk about what else there is. But there are some key specific examples while we're waiting for this larger plan. So it's not totally dire, but we all want it to move faster. I certainly get that.
Robin, would you like to add to that?
Just two things. I mean, I'm a little impatient because I know that it took 40 years of activism to get to this point. And so I'm like, in my head, it's 40 plus years now. So that's a little frustrating. And I think the only thing I've had real issue with is the kind of explanation around COVID, and that, you know, some of the delays around COVID, and granted that it's an emergency. But one of the reasons that I've heard from people that they really wanted the action plan faster was because COVID is exacerbating some of the conditions that create violence. And so I'm a little concerned. You know, I've been critical about this. I've written an article a little bit about this and my concerns around this, because this is a pattern of behavior I've seen before. But I'm hopeful now, hearing that, you know, the work is underway. I mean, there's hope.
Thank you both. I'm going to sort of give my thoughts on this, but also I think the question from Louise really hits the issue that I've seen. I echo both Karen and Robin's sentiment, and I think that the use of COVID as a reason for inaction is something that I find really troublesome. There will always be a COVID of some sort that will result in these issues being backbenched. But what COVID is highlighting for those that see is those inequities, those social, economic, health inequities, issues of overcrowding. I mean, we just looked to Nunavut, and there was one case, and in a short period of time, there's over 140 in a small community. This is because there are households with 15 people in them. And we're talking about a 2-bedroom house. This is normal. And that the poor service that we're seeing in seniors' homes, the lack of accountability and oversight, these are things that are shocking to so many Canadians, but are so normal to so many Indigenous communities and peoples, in particularly the isolated ones. The biggest concern that I've had is, and there are steps that have been taken, legislative reform, Indian Act has been amended, the criminal code has been amended, we have BC who's enacted UNDRIP legislation. There's a lot has been done. The end of birth alerts is one that we've seen some changes, but a lot of it has been sort of unilateral. And if it's not unilateral, we're not really seeing how Indigenous communities, women, survivors, and their families are being included. And so this goes to Louise, your question about how the frustration with local governments and governments regionally, nationally, not engaging with families and survivors and people with lived experience. And this has been a problem. And Louise's question specifically is, can we share with you, or can you tell us some ways, some positive initiatives where there's this cooperation? And I think the language that needs to be used is really co-development, like it's partnership, not just cooperation. And I think some examples that we're seeing happening, I'll leave the discussion about what's happening in Manitoba and Winnipeg to Karen. I'll look to the north, in my example, is really the work that's being done in the Yukon. This is a bit of a different situation because the Yukon government and the minister responsible is an Indigenous woman. By being an Indigenous woman, you are active in this issue. I think that Robin and Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is it. You cannot separate yourself from this. So Minister Dundies is really personally invested in this for her territory, and they have co-developed their strategy with the First Nations and Indigenous peoples in the territory, and engaged in that work that Robin and Karen have described, going to the communities, having the community lead the work, identify their priorities. You're right, there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, and where you start has to be driven by the community itself. So those are some examples, Louise, that I have seen. Karen and Robin, do you have any examples of cooperative development planning work with Indigenous peoples and governments and collaborative and work specifically?
One of the things that I was this week actually talking about, Louise, was the work that the City of Winnipeg is trying to do with its Indigenous Accord partners on this issue. So I was invited to speak to the annual gathering on the Indigenous Accord partners, which is essentially a group of like 200 enterprises, 200 or so enterprises within Winnipeg that have all sort of pledged to come together to make Winnipeg a safer and a better place for Indigenous people. So, you know, the words are right, the tone is right. They're really speaking the language of the principles, and that's why the principles that underlie the calls are so important. All right, and Robin's notion of nothing about us without us. But at the same time, I've heard some frustration from community groups who feel like, you know, the city is saying the right things, but, you know, is wanting to be more involved. That being said, I know that, you know, one of the organizations whose leadership I know really well, MMIWG Center in Winnipeg, has been involved in some of those discussions. And so I think there are some positive examples, but those positive examples really live where the organization or institution has taken the time to create a process that's really based in these principles for change, rather than just moving ahead and trying to build the process as they go. In other words, I think that where the examples have been successful, people have really thought through the process before trying to do all this work. And so, you know, centering these voices is, you know, in the positive examples I have, an advisory circle or a guiding circle built by and managed, or sorry, built by and guided by family members and survivors has been like the difference in the good and the bad.
Robin?
It's tough. In the Niagara region, I think the work around the report itself is really still localized. It's groups like our group at Brock or community groups who are still really kind of leading this process. And I'm not sure it's proliferated up, although Ontario did end birth alert, so that was a really good thing. But I will say that within the Niagara region, we have some progressive municipal governments who are taking a stand against anti-Indigenous racism and violence that I've never seen before. Like the very fact that I live in a city, St. Catharines, where the mayor actually intervened in 1492 Lamback Lane and issued a statement saying, please go to the table and meet with these folks and not use the police. That was a profound moment in this region, because we've had hostilities around an annual deer call in one of the provincial parks here that's created a lot of hostility. And so to have us go from a place where we were like, that was the norm, to now our municipal government is going, hey, this is not right. It took a lot of work to get there, but it's happening. And it was a lot of diligent Indigenous folks who really wanted to work on this and who really put in the time. And I mean, St. Catharines was really great in implementing an anti-racism task force and an advisory. So I think that's helping a lot too, but it's been harder. I mean, we have an interesting government in Ontario that I think this is not maybe necessarily a priority, but I'm not sure what's going on behind the scenes there.
Yeah, thank you both very much. I'm going to go on to the next question, and this comes from Rama. I hope I've pronounced your name properly. Her question is, how can more professional women become engaged in this important activity? And I think you've touched on this a bit, Robin, in particular, about reading the report and getting active. But is there anything more either of you would like to add to that?
The only thing that I would add to that is we have some resources in the final report about how to be a good ally. And I think that's really important to sort of think about is, you know, when we say that all Canadians should be allies, we're promoting a particular kind of allyship that doesn't like take over Indigenous spaces, that actually holds space. We talk about holding space for Indigenous voices. And so I would just encourage people to really read the calls for all Canadians and start by engaging in that way on a personal level. And, you know, I think there's no limit of where that can take you if you just begin.
Also, I think organizations can take up this report themselves. And that's one of the kind of interesting things I've seen is that myself and other local people who've been involved, quite often we get asked to come into organizations to talk to, you know, maybe it's a shelter and they want to learn more about this situation. Maybe it's a professional group who's just, you know, they've heard about the topic and they want to know more. And I think, you know, creating those situations where we can have that kind of dialogue is really important. And any group could decide that they wanted to make this a priority and take it up in their work. So, yeah.
I just add a little bit to that. And I think that there's like Karen and Robin have said, this is about particular allyship. And from a personal perspective, as a non-Indigenous person, what I've tried to apply and what teachings I've received is how important it is for me to do my work of learning and reading. You know, the inquiry is an example of a tremendous amount of emotional effort that was put forward into teaching us and giving us a tool to learn. But so was the TRC, so was the Royal Commission, so was the Ipperwash inquiry, so was on and on and on. And there's no shortage of reports and publications and literature and films and documentaries that can give us those teachings. I had so many families say, I'm so tired of teaching. Like I want to do, I don't want to constantly be teaching. And so that is a really important thing, to take on that work and come to the table ready, informed, and then ready to listen. I think that it's about creating space, joining a space, but not taking space that's not ours, but being there in a very honest way. I'm going to go on to, because I am cognizant of the time we have, our final question, and I believe this comes from, again, I apologize if I've mispronounced your name, Elodie. And the question is in relation to research and whether or not you guys have seen a shift in academia in terms of centering community voice and research, or more specifically, co-created research.
I'm doing it. I think Robin's doing it. We're doing it. And I think that people are really open to it. I think that like what's really interesting about when people engage with the report for the first time is that it's actually like really revealing. Like it seems like a very simple concept, but like the actual circumstances of one's life or story are incredibly revealing in a way that you wouldn't be able to engage with that in any other kind of research. And so, you know, all of the discussions that we had, the facilitated discussions that we did with the Morris Waugh Center for Dialogue, but also, you know, the research and the testimonies that people brought, all of those individual experiences and stories are so rich. And so, you know, when I go and I talk about things, or I, you know, apply for jobs or whatever I'm doing in my life, I'm always talking about how powerful this process was. And I think to some extent, Indigenous academics have been doing this for quite some time. But I'm really hoping it'll catch, because I think that, you know, its potential is really limitless. And that's what I'd say for that. So, you know, small steps, but hopefully a long journey.
Well, I can only say, I mean, I can only speak from Brock perspective at this point, because I'm very internal there, right? it's happening at Brock, but it's only because human rights, equity, and decolonization is one of our strategic pillars. I think that made it a priority. And so we're working really hard to make space for community-driven research. But I will say even before that, I think the change to the TCPS2, the Tri-Council policy statement on conducting research with Indigenous people, set the groundwork to normalize community-driven research in institutions. And I think that is a starting point, because it really sets up this idea that, you know, yes, for Indigenous people, this is core, but it also opens the door and makes people realize, well, you know, if it's true in this case, then it should also be true for other communities, that we need to meet with them, find out their needs, because otherwise, like, to me, what's the point of research? If we're not working with community and we're not doing something that benefits people around us, it's sort of that insular kind of white tower research that, you know, so many of us have fought against. And I think, at least in my colleagues that I talk to from other institutions, I think there's more space coming. It isn't ideal yet. And, you know, there's things that when you think about tenure and promotion and they go, you've only got so much time and you know how long it takes to do community research, that impact has to be considered. So I think we have some things to work on, but we're getting there.
Thank you both very much. I think, if I'm correct, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you all for your questions and for your engagement, and those who've joined us today. And thank you so much, Robin and Karen, again. Such a pleasure to see you. I really wish we were in person. Oh my goodness, I miss humans, and I miss you humans in particular. So nakormik, miigwech, nyawa, and thank you, merci. We've got some wonderful comments from the audience. Thank you, everybody. And please continue to have these conversations. I think Robin hit the nail on the head. And when I reflect on what I want to see, is I want to see people's lives go from surviving to thriving. I want that for all of our children and all of the members of our community. And I think as we struggle with a pandemic that's like this silent boogeyman, I think that we can start understanding what so much of this feels like. Former Commissioner Marie Wilson reflected in a presentation she did at Bishop's University a couple weeks ago that I joined in on. I'm a Bishop's alum and a Marie fan. And she asked the audience to think about how COVID and what we're learning can help us really understand the residential school experience, not being able to see your family, your mothers, your grandparents, your children, not being able to hug each other. And these are, and to be in institutions where you're not valued, your life's not valued. And I think that is also true for the families and survivors, that this is a wake-up call, that this is something that we can all understand, and that's something that we don't want for anyone, especially not our fellow humans. So thank you all again very, very much. And I hope this conversation and the work through the Royal Society on this issue continues. And I, for one, and I believe Karen and Robin will always show up. So thank you again. I think I'm not sure what to do with this computer, if we just stand here and look at each other, or if I press leave, or what we do, but I encourage all of you to disconnect, to go take care of yourselves, and hi Louise, and get ready for your next session.